Good evening everyone, welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy, the Hindu News Analysis. Today is 7th July 2025 and today we have some very important topics for the discussion. So one by one we'll try to discuss all these important topics in a very detailed and in-depth manner so that this discussion will be helpful for your preparation. So all important topics are from different newspapers, right? The first important topic with which we are going to start this session is about the Indian foreign trade. Now we'll be understanding some important data and key insights about India's foreign trade. And one thing that we should understand is that India's foreign trade has been growing rapidly over a period of last 2 decades. Now if you look at India's invisible trade, so we'll be understanding briefly about India's invisible hand in foreign trade. And in fact, if we talk about the international trade, so this international trade is often visualized as a shipment of physical goods. For example, if we have any manufactured goods and if we export those manufactured goods to any other country, and that we very often consider as foreign trade or an international trade across the border. However, a significant and a growing part of global commerce actually involves the intangible flows, right? So here the invisible trade is intangible flows. Now what are these intangible flows which are considered as actually the invisible hand? For example, the services. So services are also part of the intangible flows from India to other country, and it also forms part of India's foreign trade. It involves services, it involves remittances, and it also involves capital data and ideas to several other countries, and these are considered as intangible flows and they are form part of the invisible hand in India's foreign trade. However, in India's case, these invisibles, so the invisible flows from India to any other third country or any other country, so have surpassed the merchandise trade in shaping the country's external balance of trade. However, now this article has been given in the Indian Express newspaper, and this is important for your General Studies paper 3, and this article actually examines how India's foreign trade narrative largely overlooked this critical shift. Which shift? So India's intangible flows to other countries, because these invisible flows have actually surpassed the merchandise trade in shaping India's external balance. However, the problem is that how India's foreign trade narrative has actually overlooked the critical shift, and why recognizing this rising importance of these invisibles such as ideas, services, remittances is essential for understanding the true nature of India's global geo-economic engagement. However, if you look at India's evolving trade landscape, now we need to make a difference between the tangibles and intangibles. Now, if I say tangibles, so tangibles are the manufactured goods which are exported from India to other countries. However, if I say intangibles, it includes services, it includes remittances, and it also includes ideas. So all these factors would be considered part of intangibles. However, there is a surge and stagnation in goods exports from India to other countries. So let's have a look at some data with respect to the goods exports from India to other countries. Now if you look at India's merchandise exports, so which grew from 66.3 billion in the year 2003 to 2004, it increased to 318 billion US dollars by 2013 and 14. So followed by a slowdown. However, we all have experienced the COVID-19 pandemic. During COVID-19 pandemic, so the entire international trade has come to a standstill, and several countries have experienced a decline in the foreign trade. So therefore, after COVID-19 pandemic, so there was a brief recovery as well, and this recovery peak of 456 billion US dollars in the year 2022-23, and it has dipped again to 441 billion in 24-25. However, there has been a steady rise in invisible receipts. Now invisible receipts, services, and remittances, idea. So all these factors would be a part of the invisible receipts, right? So therefore, in contrast to receipts from invisibles, services and private remittances, so they actually rose consistently from 53.5 billion US dollars in 2003-4 to 576. That is a huge increase in the invisible invisible receipts to India, right? So therefore, it has actually shown us a long-term stability as well as the resilience. However, the goods exports once actually outpaced the invisibles by 85 billion in 2013-14. The trend has reversed by 24-25, with invisibles actually exceeding the merchandise by 135 billion US dollars. So this data actually reveals us, now if you make a difference between tangibles and intangibles, or visibles and invisibles, so invisibles have enormously contributing for India's overall international trade or foreign trade. However, there is a need to rethink about India's trade narrative. Now, what is a trade narrative as of now? So this trade narrative in India that has overlooked the contribution or the importance of invisibles in overall India's international trade. So therefore, there is a need to rethink India's trade narrative, right? So despite there is a dominance of intangibles in India's trade, invisibles in India's trade, so the current trade negotiations, including those with US and other important trade blocs or countries, so they remain largely focused on physical goods and cargo. So they are ignoring the invisibles despite their huge contribution in India's overall international trade. So therefore, the trade negotiation should also take into consideration the invisibles. However, India's foreign trade story is increasingly defined by the intangibles. So therefore, there has been signaling a need to shift policy and perception beyond just movement of goods. Now, foreign trade or international trade is not just about the movement of goods from India to other countries. So it's also about the intangibles, it's also about the invisibles, because these invisibles have been increasingly dominating the Indian trade. So therefore, there is a need to rethink Indian trade narratives, and that is also very important. So if you look at India's invisible trade, now we need to break this down into different components. So in the year 2004 or 24-25, so services alone accounted for 387 billion US dollars, right? So services, which forms part of the invisibles, so they accounted for 387.5 billion of India's 576 billion invisible receipts, right? So therefore, services actually have the lion's share of total invisible receipts for India, and this is a huge jump of just 26.9 billion in 2003-4 and 151.8 billion in 2013 and 14. And if we talk about the remittances, India is one of the largest country in the world which receives a huge remittances. So remittances also contributed now 135.5 billion in 24-25, growing from just 22.2 billion in 2003 and 69 billion in 2013 and 14, right? So therefore, remittances are also huge, heavily contributed for India's overall invisible trade, and these are the earnings from the global Indian workforce, right? So the remittances are actually the earnings from global Indian workforce, whether they are working in European Union countries, US, and even the Middle East, right? So remittances are the total earnings of global Indian workforce. So therefore, India's services exports, they now span software, so 180.6 billion in 24-25, business, finance, communication services, and professionals like auditors, consultants, analysts. So everything forms part of the India's invisible or intangible trade, and that has to be given the recognition, and that has to be given the importance while India is going for trade negotiations with countries like US, EU, and other important countries. And in fact, the India's foreign trade in invisibles or intangibles is also resilient to global shocks and global supply chains as well, because if you look at the merchandise exports, so they are vulnerable to the global shocks. But in contrary to that, the invisibles or intangibles trade of India with other countries is resilient to global shocks, right? So therefore it is a very important that India needs to give adequate importance to these invisibles and intangibles. India needs to emphasize on the invisibles when India is going for trade negotiations with other important countries. However, the current India-US trade negotiations, so they just remain focused on tariffs for goods like textiles, agriculture. Now here the textiles and agriculture are visibles, they are tangible, right? So therefore the current negotiations with different countries actually involving the goods, the merchandise like textiles and exports, and leaving out services exports and workers mobility, right? So in fact, if we talk about the worker mobility, services exports and remittances, they are India's real trade strength, and we should not afford to neglect or ignore India's real trade strength, which is invisibles and intangibles. I hope it is clear for you. And next important topic is about the artificial intelligence based warfare. Now we'll be understanding about this artificial intelligence based warfare and how India should prepare for this. Now what is the context and why this article has been given? Now artificial intelligence is a very important topic in Gender Studies paper 3, and this topic has been given in the Indian Express newspaper, right? So the context is that now if you look at the warfare, so this warfare has been undergoing a seismic transformation because there has been a rise in artificial intelligence, because countries like China are rapidly integrating the artificial intelligence into the multi-domain military operations. So they are increasingly adopting the artificial intelligence. So therefore it has been posing significant strategic strategic risks for nations like India. Now in this context of increasing adoption of artificial intelligence into the warfare, so this particular article explores how artificial intelligence is shaping the modern battlefields, from autonomous weapons, data-driven decision making to electromagnetic and cyber warfare. So thereby it underscores the critical role of energy infrastructure, especially nuclear power, in sustaining the artificial intelligence driven defense future, right? So countries like China, which India considers as an adversary, so they are increasingly adopting the artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence is also reshaping the modern battlefields, right? So there are autonomous weapons guided by the artificial intelligence and data-driven decision making in the battlefields, to electromagnetic and cyber warfare. So all these factors have been underscoring the critical role of energy infrastructure, right? So if we have a robust energy infrastructure, so we could have the robust artificial intelligence based defense platforms, right? So in this context, nuclear power have this capability to sustain the artificial intelligence based defense platforms and the artificial intelligence driven defense future as well. So therefore this actually highlights the importance for India, or the urgency for India, to bridge its technological and energy gaps to remain competitive in this evolving and agentic age of warfare, right? So now we'll understand China's early lead in military artificial intelligence deployment. Now we all knew that China has launched its own low-cost artificial intelligence network, which is DeepSeek AI, right? So this DeepSeek AI model, right? So Chinese People's Liberation Army had began integrating artificial intelligence into its core military functions under the concept of intelligentized warfare, right? So Chinese People's Liberation Army has actually started integrating artificial intelligence into most of its core military functions, with a concept called intelligentized warfare. And in fact, China is also extensively using artificial intelligence so that it can improve its artillery systems. And China, by integrating artificial intelligence into its core military functions, also reducing the firing intervals and increasing the overall accuracy and further enhancing their operational efficiency on the battlefield. And that's how artificial intelligence actually helping China to overall improve their operational efficiency on the battlefield. And in fact, the People's Liberation Army is also integrating the generative artificial intelligence into their drones. And now, why they are integrating artificial intelligence into drones? So to make sure they can autonomously detect and strike the enemy radar systems with a very high precision and high accuracy. So therefore, the overall technological advancements that have been achieved through a deep seek, so they are expected to further bolster Chinese efforts to expand artificial intelligence capabilities across its armed forces. So India considers China as its adversary, but on the other hand, China has been making rapid strides in integrating artificial intelligence into its warfare strategies. So India should also be prepared. India should also ready for that. Now, one reminder is that there has been an increasing collaboration between India and Pakistan in the field of artificial intelligence, and that would be a concern for India, because the experts warn that Chinese active assistance and collaboration with Pakistan's Center for Artificial Intelligence and Computing that was established in the year 2020 is a strategic threat for India, right? Because they have been focusing on cognitive electronic warfare and AI enabled decision making. So it is more concerning that recently during Operation Sindoor, China helped Pakistan providing all necessary data, right? So therefore, this active collaboration from China and Pakistan in the domain of artificial intelligence would be a strategic threat for India in the future. So therefore, India should focus on energy. So this energy is a hidden backbone of a future artificial intelligence warfare. How? So we'll be understanding that, because the modern militaries, so they must analyze the adequate amount of data across land, air, space and cyberspace. So there is a data and there is a need to analyze such a data. So therefore, in order to handle such a huge volumes of data, so it is impossible without having a robust artificial intelligence systems, right? So if we have the artificial intelligence systems, they can do this task with ease, right? So they can easily do this task. So the artificial intelligence must be powered by massive and consistent energy supply, right? So that's why we need to emphasize on energy. And in fact, technologies like machine learning, big data analytics and the natural language processing, so all these things would actually require a vast and stable electricity reserves. And nuclear energy is emerging as the most viable source to power large artificial intelligence data centers, right? So nuclear energy is the most important domain, a most important area, so that it can actually provide massive and consistent energy supplies, and that can actually drive the artificial intelligence systems and data centers. However, if you look at India's nuclear energy, nuclear energy's overall profile, India has been facing the nuclear shortfall. India is currently not producing adequate and enough quantities of nuclear energy. Now, if you look at India's nuclear energy production, it is just 7.5 gigawatt, so which is just 1/3 of South Korea's total nuclear power. So therefore this actually poses a serious limitation for the future artificial intelligence and the robotics led defense capabilities. So what we have discussed that the artificial intelligence systems actually require a robust and consistent supplies of energy, and nuclear energy can provide the necessary amount of energy to these artificial intelligence systems. But if you look at India's total nuclear energy generation, which is very low, it is just 7.5 gigawatt. So therefore this actually poses a limitation for future AI and robotics led defense capabilities. And experts even advocate for the small modular reactors. Now in our discussion we have several times discussed what are the small modular reactors. So small modular reactors are very small scale reactors. They can produce up to 300 megawatts of energy, and they can be established very close to the industries as well, right? So establishing the small modular reactors next to the artificial intelligence data centers would create a self-sustained defense tech ecosystem, enabling smart drones, robots, and next generation weaponry. So therefore India's overdependence on renewables without proper storage and earlier reduction in thermal capacity have destabilized the overall grid, and we are not able to provide massive amounts of reliable energy for the artificial intelligence systems. So therefore India must focus on generating the reliable amounts of energy from the nuclear fuel or private thermal power plants as well, so that we can provide energy for the artificial intelligence systems, and these systems can analyze a huge amount of data, and that data will provide a strategic edge over our adversaries in the modern warfare, right? So I hope you have understood this particular topic. And next topic is the Nicobar project. Now what exactly is the Nicobar project, why it is in use? So we'll be understanding some important details about the Nicobar project, and this is also very important for your examination, both prelims and mains examination. So for the mains examination, general studies paper 3, environment and biodiversity, so this is important. Now the government has planned to start a Great Nicobar infrastructure project with the financial cost of 72,000 crore. However, recently it has come under the scrutiny because the experts have clearly pointed out that the environmental impact assessment actually downplays the region's tsunami and earthquake risks. So despite there are the earlier scientific studies which indicating high seismic vulnerability in the area. So this area is seismically very vulnerable for tsunamis and earthquake risks, right? So therefore I would like to tell you what exactly is an environmental impact assessment. So if we talk about the environmental impact assessment, so it is actually the analysis of how or the assessment of how a project would impact the environment of a fragile area. Now imagine that a hydroelectricity project has been planned in an ecologically sensitive zone of Western Ghats. So therefore the environmental impact assessment is very mandatory. So the environmental impact assessment would assess how this particular hydroelectricity project would impact the existing biodiversity, would impact the existing forests and the wildlife. So therefore the appropriate measures would be undertaken. However, if it is having the disastrous consequences on the environment and the existing biodiversity, the government may not go ahead with this plan, right? So therefore they may not go ahead with this plan, and they would look for the alternatives, or even if they go ahead with this plan, they minimize the losses on the environment. So that is the environmental impact assessment. So here it is saying that the environmental impact assessment has downplayed the region's tsunami and earthquake risks, right? So if we talk about the Great Nicobar Island project, now this is the Great Nicobar, the southern part of Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which is very close to Sumatra of Indonesia. right? So which is very close to Sumatra of Indonesia. Now the Great Nicobar Island is the largest southernmost island. So you can see here, this is the largest southernmost island in the Nicobar group of islands. So all these islands are the Nicobar group of island, and the northern islands are the Andaman group of island, right? So therefore here there's a 10-degree channel which separates Andaman and Nicobar islands, right? So therefore the Great Nicobar group of island, or the Great Nicobar Island, is also home to the Galathea Bay and Campbell Bay, and even the Indira Point, which is somewhere located here, right? So Indira Point is the southernmost point of India. And in fact, so the Great Nicobar Island also declared as a Great Nicobar Biosphere Reserve and a UNESCO Man and Biosphere program to protect the biodiversity of that particular area. And it is also a biodiversity hotspot because it is home to tropical evergreen forests, endemic flora, fauna, including Nicobar crab eating macaque and leatherback turtles. And in fact, this Galathea Bay Wildlife Sanctuary is it was denotified in the year 2021. It was notified in 1997 to conserve the nesting sites of leatherback turtles. So this Galathea Bay Wildlife Sanctuary in the Great Nicobar Island is known for the leatherback turtles nesting sites, and it also falls under the Coastal Regulation Zone 1A, and it is having the highest ecological sensitivity. Now, what are the key components of this Great Nicobar Island project? So as part of this particular project, so there will be an international container transshipment terminal at the Galathea Bay will be developed, and Greenfield International Airport will also be planned and developed in this Great Nicobar project, and gas and solar based power plant, Greenfield Township and tourism projects will be developed, and cruise terminal, ship repair and exports will also be developed as part of the Great Nicobar project in the Great Nicobar Island, right? These are the key components. However, if you look into the impact, the disastrous environmental impact of this Great Nicobar project on the biodiversity or the local tribes who are living in those forests, so over 8.5 lakh trees to be felled over an area of 130 square kilometers if we go ahead with this particular project. And it will also result in destruction of the tropical rainforests in the Galathea National Park, so which is home to around 648 species of flora and fauna, so including the Nicobar's wild pig, tree shrew, Great Nicobar crested serpent eagle, Nicobar paradise flycatcher and Nicobar megapode, right? So this project will pose massive threat to all these important flora and fauna. And in fact, Shompen tribe, so this Shompen tribe is also one of the particularly vulnerable tribal group which is living in the Nicobar group of island. And if we go ahead with this project, so it may even pose threat to the Shompen tribe, right? Because these are important foraging grounds for the hunter-gatherer nomadic community. And apart from that, so this project will also pose threats to the nesting sites of iconic species such as a giant leatherback turtle and Nicobar megapode. And in fact, it may even emerge as a threat to coral and marine ecosystems, because the Geological Survey of India has already reported the presence of 117 species of corals in Galathea. But the environmental assessment of the project states that there is no coral located in the Galathea Bay region. So therefore, the environmental impact assessment has actually undermined the ecological importance of the Nicobar Island, the Great Nicobar Island. And dugong mammals, so dugong sea cow, so this project may even pose threats to the dugong due to the loss of sea grasses, meadows, and even rising anthropogenic activities in the Great Nicobar area, right? So I hope it is clear. However, the Great Nicobar or the overall Andaman and Nicobar group of islands are also very important and very significant because they are very close to Strait of Malacca, and they are very close to Indonesia, Southeast Asia, because India has Act East policy, Indo-Pacific vision of India. So because of all these factors, so Andaman and Nicobar group of islands is also very, very important. So therefore the essence is balancing the environmental concerns with the strategic significance, and that is very, very important. So overall minimizing the environmental impact of this particular project on the Andaman and Nicobar group of islands and the livelihoods of the particularly vulnerable tribal groups in the island chain. And next important topic is the Khelo Bharat Niti. Now we'll be understanding what exactly is a Khelo Bharat Niti, a recent policy that has been launched by the Union government to give a sustained push to football in India. So recently, Union Cabinet has approved the Khelo Bharat Niti 2025, and this Khelo Bharat Niti 2025 is a comprehensive national sports policy. And this comprehensive national sports policy aimed at building Vikasit Bharat through sports. And in fact, the policy has also outlined 5-pillar framework, and that includes emphasis on football development, diaspora talent, grassroots access, and even integration with the national education policy. Right, so this particular national sports policy focuses on 5 key pillars. They are the football development, diaspora talent, grassroots access, integration with the national education policy. Now if you look at the policy itself, Khelo Bharat Niti 2025, so which was passed on July 1st 2025. So this actually marks a transformative shift in India's sports framework, right? So this is a comprehensive policy that actually look at India's sports talent, encourage the sporting talent, so thereby realizing the vision of Vikasit Bharat by the year 2047. Right, so India is the most populous country, but if you look at India's performance in major sporting events, it is subpar performance. Right, so therefore this has been considered as a transformative shift in India's sports framework, particularly positioning football as a strategic driver of India's national development. And in fact, it also aligns with India's vision of Vikasit Bharat, using sports as a tool for national pride, global recognition, and even the inclusive growth agenda. Now in fact, the Union Sports Minister Mansukh Mandaviya has actually showcased government commitment through the Khelo Bharat Niti 2025. And in fact, the key emphasis will be given for the football as part of the Khelo Bharat Niti 2025. However, football is no longer seen as merely a recreational game, but a catalyst for economic, educational, and the societal development. However, recently India has expressed its intent to host the 2036 Olympics, and therefore it underlines India's long-term vision where the international sporting events will gain traction domestically, will encourage, will inspire the youth to adopt those sports. And there is also a possibility that there will be attitudinal and behavioral change among the people towards the sports as well, so that we can produce more and more sporting talent in India. Now there are 5 pillars of this framework, and if you look at the 5 pillars of the frameworks, so this actually stresses on the sports excellence that India needs to achieve, seeking to achieve or elevate the national football team's global standing through a focused training and even the international exposure to the Indian football team. And in fact, football is also viewed as a medium of social inclusion, so thereby helping communities overcome the barriers and even fostering the youth engagement and gender equality as well. And in fact, football is also having a huge commercial potential through events, merchandise, job creation. So therefore, a sports, particularly football, will lead to the economic development. So we need to focus on sports-led economic development as an aspect as well. And in fact, the policy also seeks to ignite the mass participation in sports, thereby making football a part of people's movement at the grassroots level. And in fact, sports in school curricula is a cornerstone, so thereby reinforcing football's overall role in building character, discipline, teamwork among all the students, right? So if you look at the football as a sports, it is very important that we need to identify the grassroots level sporting talent and encourage the talent. So All India Football Federation, so it has started a grassroots model, and that model focuses on children who are aged between 8 to 10 years, so thereby ensuring early exposure to football and also a structured skill development from the very young age itself. And in fact, as players grow 12 to 13 years old, they are introduced to competitive platforms and then move to high performance centers, right? So thereby a concerted sustained push will be given for all the students to further encourage them, right, and further extract or further build them into best players from under 17, under 20. So players are preferred for the professional circuit, so thereby ensuring a pipeline from youth to elite football. And in fact, in this identifying the grassroots sporting talent, schools play a pivotal role, providing infrastructure, providing time, and even integration into the formal education as emphasized by National Education Policy. Under the Football for Schools program, over 1.53 lakh schools are covered and 9.26 lakh footballs distributed, and it is part of a mass outreach program to further encourage people's participation and make football a mass movement, right? So I hope you have understood about this particular national sports policy. And that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much. So if you like a lecture, please subscribe our YouTube channel and also hit the like button. Thank you.